Let's create 4 identical feet for the sofa, and that will show some non-destructive workflows in which, for example, we can adjust the shape of all 4 of the feet at once using a flare deformer. Create the object in the corner here. Let's get up close. And let's look at this in the top and perspective views. Tap the space bar, getting close in the top view. And I'll set my background back to gray with Alt-B. Create polygon primitives cylinder. Create that in the top view. And then drag it up in the perspective view. Watching it in the other view, make sure it's just, tall enough. Check that out. If we change the height, we'll also need to adjust translate Y. Let's say, for example, I want to set height to exactly 20 centimeters. Press enter. Now it's not touching the floor anymore. I'll set translate Y now to 10 centimeters. All right, that's our foot. Let me dolly back a little bit. We can go into the P cylinder 1, rename it, call it foot 1. Essentially, it's where we need it to be, but we just want to increase its level of detail. In the inputs, choose polycylinder 1, change some of these, set the radius to just 3 centimeters. Subdivision axes to 24. I need more divisions here. Getting close. 24 subdivisions as opposed to 20. So there's 20 and 24. Subdivision's height, 12. And the caps, in fact, I'll set to 0. Let me show you this. If I go into the panel toolbar here, I can enable a mode. Kind of have to collapse some of this other stuff to get to it. Here it is. Isolate select. Click on that with the object selected. And now everything else is hidden. We can tumble around with this. If you don't have tumble on object already enabled, you should turn that on too. Go to the view menu and choose camera tools, tumble tool, options. We want to have tumble on object enabled. And now when you click on an object to tumble, it will become the center of the rotation or orbit. Alt and middle mouse to tumble, and I can tumble around just that object more cleanly. Here we've got subdivisions caps, set it to 0. Just cleans up the model, less for us to worry about. That's all there is to that for the topology. We want to add a deformer to shape it up. Let's go into the animation menu set. Animation. Create deformers. Nonlinear. Flare. And with that object selected, now I've got a flare 1 handle. You might not see it. Maybe go into X-ray mode. Here we're isolated, so we won't see it. Here, it's sort of highlighted, but it's hiding under other things, so it's hard for us to see. So we can bomb out of isolation and look at this with just X-ray mode, and now we can see our flare handle. We can go to the inputs, and we have start flare X and start flare Z. Keep these equal if you want this to be a circle. If they're unequal, you'll get an oval. I'll select both of those and middle mouse drag, and you'll see I'm adjusting the bottom. I'm just tapering that a little bit. We got a couple other little controls here. We got the curve, we can play with that, middle mouse drag. So you can see that's causing a bulging effect. I can also move the handle, and that'll have an effect too. Grab the move tool, position that up, and you can see how it's having an influence up to a limit point as set on these boundaries. I can increase the low boundary, middle mouse drag that. Now I've moved that out. Back to the move tool again, and sort of feel my way through constructing this shape. Maybe I'll turn on wireframe in this view. Go back to wireframe on shaded. Tap the space bar and kind of admire that. Pretty good. Basically, this one's finished. I probably want to just pay some attention to the UVs, not a lot. I can create a procedural texture on here, which means that the UVs kind of want to be optimized to the 0 to 1 space. Otherwise, you may have resolution issues or kind of aliasing in your textures. So I want to select the object now, foot 1, and go into its UV texture editor. Back to the polygons menu set. Edit UVs, UV texture editor. And we don't really care about these circles here. Those represent the caps at the top and bottom. No one will ever see those, so we actually don't care about them. All we care about is this area. And that is, in fact, the mapping on the surface here. So that we can see what we're doing here, we can assign a texture or use a display mode in order to see the UV mapping directly on the object. I want to exit out of X-ray mode. And I want to select the object and add a material. Right-click, assign new material. It can just be a standard blend. And rename it. Foot blend or something like that. Press enter. And for the color, we can add a render node. Click to create render node. And choose the file node type. And browse for it. It's already in our source images, UV image 1 JPEG. This is a UV test image, and there are many online for you to choose from, so you can go grab one. This is just a random one I have from my library. Click open, and now we've got some idea of the texture mapping on here. And when we look at both the object and its UV layout at the same time, we can make the adjustments and kind of understand what we're doing. I want to be in shell component mode. Right-click and choose shell. Click on that center shell and scale it. Scale it equally, clicking on the yellow center icon there. And fill up that space, but don't go beyond the space. Because in this case, we're going to create a procedural texture, and Maya wants us to set it up like this for a procedural texture. It's kind of optimized for that now. Very cool. If we want, we can actually create our material now. I can right-click and go back to object mode. Instead of this test material, we can break this connection. So I've already got a connection to color here. Get rid of it. Right-click on the name of any attribute in the attribute editor, and you get a pop-up menu, and you can choose break connection. It doesn't delete the file node, and it doesn't delete the file from disk. Now that we've broken that connection, we'll just set a base color here by clicking on the slot. I'll make it sort of a chocolate brown. We're trying to match this texture here, and in fact, if we want, we can sample it directly. Go back to the color swatch here, click on it, and from the color picker, choose the eyedropper. We can get a preview. Click on that, we've actually sampled that color. As you can see, that's considerably brighter than what I had. In order to make it stand out, let's give it some specular components. Select it, scroll down to specular shading. We don't want any reflectivity, no mirrors. Eccentricity, increase a bit, and also specular roll-off, decrease it. Increase the specular color, and now I've got a little bit of a highlight there. Don't want it to be shiny, I just want it to sort of reflect a little bit of gloss. Cool. To make that stand out under lighting, let's add a bump map. Go back in there. Bump mapping. Click on that. And this time we'll use a procedural texture. We can make it a 2D texture. Let's choose noise. And if we're in viewport 2.0 in our renderer, then we should be able to see that noise texture pretty clearly. I can zoom in on that. Very clear. And as you see, we're looking at a bump 2D node. We can adjust that depth, do strange things to it, make it negative and so on. And we can also go into the noise node. Bring the amplitude down about half, or directly half. We've got depth max. That's the complexity of it. Let's bring that up to 4. As you can see, we've got a little bit more detail. Most importantly, the noise type here. Change that to wispy. And now I've got a pseudo wood map applied. A little bit of shine on there. We can turn wireframe on shaded back off again. And with tumble on object, if I click on it, now we orbit around it. Note that we've got a seam back here with our procedural texture. So that is one of the downsides to it. But essentially, we've got a quick and dirty texture on there that from a distance is going to be fine. Now we're ready to make duplicates of it. So select it and go into Edit, Duplicate Special Options. and reset it. Choose Edit, Reset Settings. We need to make sure we're all in the same settings to begin with. From here, we have options to create different types of copies. There are essentially 4 different types. Here you'll see Geometry, Type, Copy, or Instance. If it's a copy, then you're baking the current construction history out to a new shape node. And from there, you can continue to sculpt it or whatever you want, but there'll be no connection between the 2 objects from that point forward. If you choose Instance, then the 2 objects always share the same shape node, and whatever is done to one is done to all. And here we got a couple other options down here that are quite interesting. To enable those, I need to switch this back to Copy, and we'll see Duplicate Input Graph. That makes a copy of all incoming graph nodes or incoming history nodes. For example, I have a flare here, and that flare is an input to the shape of the foot. Go into wireframe with the 4 key. And because there's a history connection, we see that when I select the flare, the foot highlights in magenta, indicating an incoming connection. The foot is dependent on the flare. When we enable Duplicate Input Graph, we make a copy of the flare as well to our new object, trying to preserve the upstream connections as best as possible. The most interesting one is the one we're going to do here, which is Duplicate Input Connections. And that's very similar to Instance, except the difference here is that we have 2 shape nodes instead of 1. They're both the output of the same history. In other words, they're both the sort of equation of the formula of the construction history, or the node graph for the object. So the shape is the final output of all the construction history. In the case of Instance, it's a shared shape. In the case of Duplicate Input Connections, we have now 2 new shapes that are generated from the same history. And the reason we have that is so that we can do things like enable different display properties or render status properties for the 2 objects. But they will behave like instances in as much as we will be able to affect them all with our upstream history nodes, such as the flare. This is the option I want to choose. Duplicate Input Connections, and select the foot, and click Duplicate Special. Now we've got foot 2. You can grab it and move it. Probably in the top view. Tap the space bar, go in the top view, and position it. Press the F key to frame it. Go back to all 4 views and make the final adjustment. Foot 2 is in place. If I go back to foot 1's flare handle, select it, go back into its flare inputs, I can affect both of the objects at the same time. Start flare X and Z, I'll select both of those, and then middle mouse drag in the viewport, and I can affect both of the objects with the same flare. Cool, we're ready to make the rest of the duplicates. Just select, hold down the Shift key, select the other object, and once again go into Edit, Duplicate Special, but we'll just use the same options this time, so we don't need to go into the option box again. And in the top view, dolly back, and move them over. Got foot 3 and foot 4 now. We can zoom in on that. Shift F will zoom the selected objects in all views. Maybe go closer in the top view without losing the selection. Position that. Very good. Those are all created now. Go back to shaded mode 5. Textured mode is 6. Tap the space bar, make it big. We've got our feet in place. We probably want to rotate them so they're not all facing the same way. Hide that seam a little bit differently on each one. Probably no one's ever going to see that, but just to be on the safe side. Very good, we've got our feet in place. I'm choosing not to delete the construction history in this case. We will output a final asset version which has been baked down to raw shapes. But in this case, maybe I want to go back and change the flare or some other parameter later. We're in a good place now to increment and save.